All right, everyone. We got Andreas here today. So I've known Andreas for a very long time, and from many years ago when the CEO came in and said, "I've got this really great developer. You should hire him." And I thought, "Oh, CEO recommended developer. This will be good." But look, Andreas broke the mold. He's been brilliant ever since. One of the best guys I know. I've seen him do a lot of really cool stuff, but we went through his presentation on Sunday and he started taking me through it, and I went, wow, this is cool. So for those of you that like to see the inner workings of a DevOps beast, this is a bit of a treat. So I won't keep any longer. We'll get on with it, hey? Andreas.
Right.
Switch over.
Thanks for that introduction, Tim. Kind words.
Mate.
Thank you. Let's see if we can start presenting. No.
I might add, actually, it says there, Andreas Newlick, Solution Specialist, Data and AI. DevOps is, I think, he's the DevOps.
One of the key skills, yeah. Right. Great. So can everybody see that?
Perfect.
Is that presenting? Okay, great.
Yeah, all good.
Well, hello everybody. Yes, so I was going to talk about my experience so far at Anglo American. So we started consulting at Anglo American about a year ago now, September, August last year. It was only a handful of us, and we've grown to quite a team. So it's been a really fun experience there, and part of that was really working with lots of vendors and lots of other consulting companies, and that just means opportunity to learn lots more. And in this case, I was hoping to share a bit of the experience that I've had specifically on the platform infrastructure or platform automation, and specifically infrastructure as code, and how the DevOps can assist with that. Let's see, let's move that one out of this screen. Yep. Okay, so that's move on. So obviously, Tim has given a bit of an introduction, but again, about me, I'm a solution specialist consultant at Empire. For the last few years, part of the data and AI and integration practice, but I have extensive experience and skills in the bespoke application development and everything that goes with it. So that's been an interesting space to learn, coming from a CI/CD background and always believing in that, strongly believing it, bringing it into the data space, which brings its own challenges and data ops, and that's something else to talk about. But in general, the practice that I'm working on, and obviously at Anglo American, there is in that group that we work in, the data and analytics group within Anglo, there's obviously a lot of work, different types of work, cross-functional work, and most of the DevOps that I'll be talking about today is mostly about the bespoke application deployments or the infrastructure needed for that. Maybe another talk talking about the more the data DevOps space. Talking about data, I love cycling, and there's a lot of data in cycling. There's so many variables, data guy, I love all of that, but something a bit more less technical, but more about eating, which I love doing. I thought I'd just share a bit of information on, what it takes to ride your bike for 3 weeks, participating in a Tour de France event. So what the guys do there, they need about, on average, they need about 8,000 calories a day just to maintain that's their body weight, just given the amount of energy they need to ride every day's stage. What that means is, I've made some notes there of what that takes. As you can see, they're constantly eating during the day, pretty much grazing all day. And there's just a couple of fun facts of how much they need to eat to be able to upkeep that for 3 weeks. Obviously, I think that's a skill in itself to be able to eat that much. Obviously, they take their time eating, so you'll notice a lot of the interviews that they do, besides the race interviews, is by the table eating. So I thought that was quite interesting. Yeah, what else? Before we kick off with the DevOps, something interesting, fun facts of the Tour de France is that they used to have beers and all kinds of alcoholic beverages during the race just to take the edge off. And as you can see, they, in 1960, they stopped that and believed it was a stimulant. So no more alcohol no more alcoholic drinks during the Tour de France. They have rigid blood tests. And last one, smoke, believe it or not. They thought that, having a smoke before they attack a hill was a good thing, opening up the lungs. How far we've come. Anyway, that's a couple of fun facts before we kick off. So yeah, about me, I love riding, cycling. That's a big part of my life, and I thought I'd integrate that in this talk. Cool, let's kick off. So, like I said, platform and automation, a couple of bullet points here about the talk is, infrastructure as code. I'll show some of the DevOps build pipelines that we do. Obviously, I'll talk about some of the archetypes. It's kind of archetypes in the sense of you might have a machine learning environment. That's an archetype. That's a container or grouping of resources for specifically machine learning. We'll have a web app environment where we'll have app services running with storage accounts, etc., and other archetypes. And then just coming back to the DevOps principle, easy, repeatable, secure, making life easier and transparent. So what is the challenge? How can we help Anglo? How could we help Anglo? So as I mentioned, we're working closely with the data analytics groups. There's obviously several groups in Anglo American. And for those who don't know Anglo American, it's a gold mining company with a portfolio that spans quite a few resources, diamonds, platinum, copper, iron ore, and more. They're obviously a global company, and those mining sites are across quite a few continents. Most of the work that we work with is Chile, obviously quite a few vendors in Canada, also quite a bit of mining there, but mainly we deal with the UK guys and the South African guys. Yeah, so their mantra, data analytics group, is data-driven, people-focused. So what they want to do, their mission statement, especially for this kind of space, is reimagine the digital tools used for planning, execution, and simulation across the core of their value chain, from resource definition to the output of the plant. So that's what their group is focused on, and specifically to this talk here is we would like to manage the data analytics infrastructure using infrastructure as code. And an easy, repeatable, secure, and an automated approach. I guess I've got to mention a few things here. This is obviously quite a new effort. So obviously when we talk, these mining companies have been around for a long time. They have a lot of legacy systems, etc., per site, on-site, on-premise. So a lot of this work that we're doing here is from the ground up in the cloud. So part of that is, or privilege or the opportunity here is, starting from scratch, focusing on new projects, and not much not working on much legacy systems. Obviously integrating with some of the systems on site, but most of the projects that we're working on here are almost think of it as a stand-up proof of concept startup company like approach, where we have a lot of projects that where we just want to proof of concept it, make sure it has the business value that was intended. So a lot of it is, yeah, that gives us the opportunity to focus really on the best practices when it comes to cloud and automation and DevOps from a process perspective. So that's a business challenge. So focusing on breaking that down. So what Anglo wants to focus on is obviously those key areas: speed, obviously quality, and then obviously increase productivity and transparency. I guess that transparency is really important. Anglo deals with a lot of vendors, consulting vendors, but also system vendors. And obviously that transparency is crucial to see what's going on, what's being deployed, what's being worked on. Yeah, so not just on the infrastructure as code perspective, but everything around DevOps. Yep. So the design, in a nutshell, is focusing on the framework of how can Anglo as a business, as a group, facilitate projects, new projects to fast track that infrastructure that's required for each project. So the way that they've done that is kind of a modular approach. So environments will have an app service. Think of an app service as a template. Consider that as a module at a granular level. But then obviously those archetype templates, they will contain several of those modules, collection of resource templates that are linked together. And so the framework really wants to do is abstract that complexity. And always using the YAML. There's obviously different ways of doing infrastructure deployments and provisioning. Anglo adopting a YAML approach, which is easy to use. It's easy to parameterize, and it's a known standard. So I've got to make a note here, or a kudos to Avanade. So that's the consulting company that we work with to collaborate with to make this all possible. So Avanade was tasked to be part of project teams to help them do that in a consistent way and a best practice way, so that we have that the same level of quality and best practice approach across all projects. So all they do, so that's a dedicated focus from Anglo, is to make sure that this is not just a once-off effort, but it's a continuous evolving framework that runs just like any other project. It has sprints, it has sprint goals, it has everything managed in DevOps, Azure DevOps, from managing the backlogs to deploying to sharing those artifacts. So it's a team of 4 to 6, depending on the capacity needed for each sprint. So working closely with those guys has been a learning experience. Oh, it's oops, maybe just a diagram at the top there is it's just what has been good is that collaboration between the infrastructure as code and the project. So what we have, the projects own the pipeline, or the master YAML template that really then triggers off all those other templates. I'll talk about how it does that, but at a high level, that's a modular approach. All right, let's move on. So I mentioned best practices, and I've mentioned multiple vendors and multiple consulting companies. So this is really an effort to have that consistency, pick a best practice that vendors and other other implementation teams can use. But it's all fine and well if we, stick to, how you do YAML, etc. But fundamentally, it's a big topic. Security needs to be part of that. So I think that's been an area where I've learned a lot more than that I've known before. Is how do you holistically, you have several components, modules within an environment. How do you make sure that that security is good from outside, but also internally? What's a resource or service within a resource group has access to another resource, and locking it down that way. So quite a bit of learning there. There's obviously a lot to talk about it. When I spoke to Tim on Sunday, going, what do I need to focus on? It's been a bit tough. We do quite a bit. So I'll try and skim over things. Happy to talk about a bit more detail if needed in the breakout sessions afterwards. But at a high level, it's those three areas: role-based access control. I talked about a startup mentality, not mentality, but a culture. Little red tape of getting stuff deployed, making sure people have opportunity to do that and have a capacity to do that. But you still want some form of rigor. You want it to be secure. You want some form of governance and control. So there's still a dedicated way of doing things. So when we talk about security, there's different areas of roles. So those are the typical, the Azure resources, the DevOps who can do pull requests, who can merge into the develop branch, etc. From that perspective, from the process approach, but also when it comes to data lake and API subscriptions. So all of these things need to be considered in terms of restricted access and who has access to what. So we can use, obviously, it's all integrated with the Active Directory of Anglo. So making sure that we have those dedicated groups and assigning those roles to each of those groups is essential. That's that. So moving on to, obviously, the API manager. So we can quite easily talk about those environments that host the or that do the orchestration or the low-level resources that's needed to run an application. But there's a lot around it. So when we look at the external access, especially, you want to adopt best practices. Front doors, the latest feature from Azure. I think it's out of preview since the beginning of this year. So making sure that we're up to date, using front door as an initial access point from external traffic, making sure that there is a gateway, but ultimately that all of the API, all the RESTful APIs are managed through API Manager. Trying to avoid the point-to-point, too much point-to-point integrations. So sure, we have singular projects running, but you still want some common way of integrating. So using the hub and spoke model and to share information. You don't want to redo common functionality across every project. So that's all part of the infrastructure as code. It's not really just doing the internal resource group, as you can see. I don't know if you can see that. It's not just the resource group that we do, but making sure that all the access, all the security is also done. And there's good tools in Azure to assist with that. And all of that is scripted. Except for some of the things like SSL certificates. Obviously, they need to be purchased and installed. But for the most part, once you have that, you can always redeploy. And lastly, access control lists. So it's fine and well giving people access to resource groups and managing on a row level, role-based approach. But when we come to the data lake, coming back to that, the data space, you don't want to create several data lakes. You want to have a common data lake that people can use to access published data or publish data to. So that whole role-based access doesn't quite work there anymore, because obviously in our case we'll have root level containers that we have a convention for, a naming convention, So what's needed here is more low-level access control lists that manage that data. So for each container, so for one project, not necessarily have access to the entire data lake, but really just to a section of that. And again, that's all scripted. That's running Python scripts to access those data lakes and apply those changes. Cool. So moving on. So that best practices in a nutshell with a focus on security. Archetypes. Looking at some of the. If you don't mind, I'll have a look at the comments a bit later. I'm just mindful of time. I'll go through the slides first. If you're happy, I'll respond to those questions afterwards. So yeah, as I mentioned, we have quite a few environments, and that list is growing. But from the work that we do, we focused on those main environments. And again, if you're going to do some kind of data science work, the infrastructure, the environment is going to be very similar. Sure, you can tweak it here and there, and these templates or these archetypes will accommodate that, just based on the parameterized approach that it accommodates. There's a lot to talk about across all those templates, but what I'll focus on is really the web application. I think it's a more common or more default environment or known environment, so I'll focus on that. So, what is, it's standardized of the web application. So the challenge that Anglo had is that vendors did things very differently, understandably. Everybody has different strengths in different areas. So you might have an Angular app, in this case, or a Vue app, or a React single-page application. So what's been decided on that it's going to be a React with a .NET Core backend. So standardize that approach. So if vendors do start implementing, there are common libraries that we use just to have that foundation set. And it just makes the review and readiness approvals much easier if we have that consistent approach. So this is what the templates cater for. So as you can see, you'll have one-to-many app services. App services really hosting the web application, so the API and the UI. We'll have obviously a service plan that defines the quota for those app services. And yeah, I won't go through all that list, but that, as you can see in a nutshell, that's what a typical environment will look like. And as you can see, that out of the box, that comes with the security configuration in terms of limited access, in terms of virtual networks and network security groups and subnets, and what has access to what, obviously, and a key element of that is the key vault that really contains all the sensitive data in terms of connectivity, at least. So that's what it looks like. And later on, I'll show how we create one of those. So what does it mean now that you have that available? So when projects start up, the infrastructure team member is assigned to that team. What Anglo doesn't want is what they want to cause any bottlenecks or dependencies or a kind of a waterfall approach. So it's really agile approach of cross-functional agile teams. And so what we do there is we have a team dedicated to initial setup, trying to understand the requirements for the project. So not every project is going to have exactly the same requirements. We're just making sure that the infrastructure as code requirements are understood. And if other resources are needed, that those get built and provisioned within the infrastructure as code team. So they're essential part of that, regardless of what vendor. They'll get a team because every vendor needs to apply those standards and conventions. And as I mentioned, we're working on bigger projects where there might be multiple vendors involved. And again, that just means good collaboration and a consistent approach. Yeah, what I wanted to mention here is obviously the adoption rate is pretty good because firstly it's mandated. It's part of, if you want to go to production environment, if you want that robustness in terms of the environment and supported environment, it needs to be proven that you have deployed your application through an automated approach and a repeatable and redeployable approach, and that applies to both the infrastructure but also the solution. So that's part of the readiness checklist to make sure that that's done. So it's essential that that team member is part of that to make sure that it qualifies. Right. So moving on. What's next? Yeah. Yep, here comes the developer in me. Automation, making my life easier. So obviously you don't want to do this for every environment. So typically we have 4 separate environments, completely split by subscription. So you want to automate. So how do we do it? Let's get into the detail. So before I talk on this is how to get started. I'll talk about how projects will use these templates. But in the meantime, I'll kick off a build in Azure, and then we can have a look what it does. Let me know if you don't see the screen. So here we have, this is I've logged in with my Anglo account. We are in the subscription dev test. If I do a refresh here, we don't have any resources, it's empty. What we'll do is, I have here, this is a project ACL, it's in the geo stream of work that we do. Here we have a pipeline set up, it's a build pipeline. And what we have here, this is run twice before. I thought I could, yeah, twice before. Just refresh that. Yep, twice before. Yep. Okay. I've lost the mask. Can anybody still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Andreas. You're frozen. Your face is frozen, but we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Can you see my screen? Can you see the DevOps pipeline?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Yeah, so let's have a look. So we're going to run this pipeline. We'll just take the latest what's in develop branch. There's obviously a couple of there for the time being, but I'll just kick that off. So what I'm expecting here is this is a infrastructure as code for the web template for the dev environment in terms of naming conventions. So what it's going to do is execute that template, and for this environment, what's not part of the web template is a container registry. So this is the modular approach. So we've added a separate job which creates a container registry. As that ticks along, I'll carry on with the slides. That should take about 15 minutes. And as you can see here, just to maybe illustrate, this is the main pipeline, the master pipeline is running in this project. So it's using this develop branch, but it has a dependency on the infrastructure as code repository on that specific release. So that's the match between the two. Cool. While that runs, I'll let that churn along. So this is the part, the resources that. So what this is an extract from the YAML. I might just jump into the YAML shortly in my Visual Studio Code. But at a high level, what we use is we have a dedicated pool of build agents that's been defined, and It has elevated privileges to do that, to apply the security security aspects, but also to have the ability to contribute to that resource group, together with the service principles that we've defined at the bottom here, which is the connected service name. So we have a dedicated pool to run these infrastructure as code deployments. We have a bunch of variables that comes back to parameterizing those templates. So as you can see here, there's a couple of things that we need to define. Where is the key vault that we need to use to deploy sensitive resources? The increment, obviously we can have several app services running, so that's the increment counting those identical resources. And then coming to the money shot is really the dependency to that separate repository. We looked at different ways of using that code through universal packages, unpacking it, but the simplest way was, just link to that separate DevOps space, which is DA capabilities in this space. The code repository is infrastructure as code, and so that's your dependency. And in this case, as you can see, it's a release branch, so that's fixed to that release branch. So every now and so often they have a release and nothing changes. So that's an easy way to reference that YAML, those templates in that. And then what you do is you reference, so as you've called it the IAC, infrastructure as code. Over here you can then reference the at a repository at the top. That means if it looks for that template, instead of looking in the project repository, it looks at the infrastructure as code repository. So as you can see here, that's all the project needs to run, to provision. It looks like a lot, but if you've built a lot of templates before, that doesn't look like much. So it's quite, from a project perspective, if you need to change things, it's mostly changing a variable here or there. Obviously, if there's something more fundamentally not working, it's just one of the infrastructure code guys that can help you. Yeah, as you can see, as with the previous slide, we create applications. Here it's a list of application app services that we create. We link each one of them to App Insights. We have key vaults. We have then SQL databases. We have storage accounts, one or many, and then obviously virtual networks and subnets. And as you can see at the bottom, here's another reference to that separate resource. So I mentioned, the archetype. So the top one is a web app environment, and this one is just a singular resource, which can be found in the virtual networks. This is the subnet. So the first one, it creates a subnet for that container registry, making sure it's in the same one. Obviously, the screenshot doesn't include the other steps. Let's see if I can show that. Environment templates. Yeah, there we go. So that's the one on the right. That's actually the template infrastructure. I need to show this one. This is that's included in that screenshot. As you can see, the dependency on that extra container registry is then that's extra part here, where we need to set up the subnet or link it to the same subnet, and then create the template for the container registry. You can see that's obviously not good, so that might just be switched off for the initial validation, just to make sure that the application works. But obviously, going into production, that all needs to be set to true. So that's a simple flag to make sure that that's all done and locked down. As you can see, the same here for storage account. So in dev mode, you want to be able to look at the storage account. You want to browse the data that is either fetched or created. So that's why it's disabled here. But at least you have the ability. So what we have here, as you can see on the left, we have the same YAML for each environment. We have one for dev, pre-prod, prod, and test. And that gives you the flexibility to tweak a single environment-specific stuff. So, for example, in Dev, you might not need to scale as much or vertically or horizontally. So you might have a reduced capacity or resource needed for Dev, and you can then change that. So an example here is the app services, the size of that. Where was it? Thought I saw that somewhere. Standard size. Oh, yeah, here we go. So those are the kind of the service plan size here that you can then tweak across those environments. The good thing about so these are the templates of that infrastructure as code. As you can see, there's heaps of it, and it's just an invaluable resource to have. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. So obviously this grows from sprint to sprint. But what I can show here is how they do it. So this is the entry. This is the actual template for the web app template, and as you can see, so much parameterizing. It's not funny. It's pretty. It's pleasant to see. It's really good to see. But a good way of doing it, seeing that they're contributing or changing this stuff from sprint to sprint. It's good to see that they have tests too. So you'll see for each of the resources, they'll have a test YAML too. And what the test YAML then does, it creates in their sandbox environment a web app environment, and then it does a couple of tests afterwards. So for example, they have scripts running to test the firewall, to test that it's been enabled. There's a number of tests that they run, which makes sure that they try and reduce as much regression as possible. Obviously, once a project has used infrastructure as code release, there's not often a demand to change that version. But obviously, if you have a new version, you want to make sure that things still work. So seeing these tests run, they have obviously their DevOps environment, their build pipelines that execute these, and it gives you a surety. And coming back to that transparency perspective, anybody can, or the people that have dependency, the projects that have dependency on these infrastructure as code artifacts, they can see that. So it is good to see. And the other good thing is given that transparency, is that any developer can contribute to something. So, if you have capacity in the project to contribute, raising a pull request or adding a new resource. So, for example, if a project has a Synapse, for example, or any other resource that's not currently supported, nothing prevents projects to contribute to that in a form of pull request and a review. Yeah, so that's about it from that perspective. Oh yeah, so I've jumped the gun here. That was the tests. So that's good to see. So that's an extract of the actual build pipeline of what it does for each of those steps. So the first step is really creating. This is the test. So the first job is really executing the main web app template, and then it goes through the second job, which is testing. So obviously there's so much more that you can test, but obviously the focus has been making sure that it's at least secure and access is limited. And then obviously, as per any other Azure documentation, there's a last step of how to clean up your resources. So this is really just deleting all those resources again and making sure that sandbox is left in a clean state. Cool, so typical DevOps, practice what you preach, also from an infrastructure perspective, so they do the same as any other app dev team. I think that's it. I think that's it in terms of slides. Let's have a look at how far our... So let's do a refresh here. Oh, yep, things have been added. Let's see the actual resource. So it's still running. So if we have a look at the initialization, So using the hosted agents. Yeah, so what we can do is it does some validations before. So because of the strong parameterization of these templates, you want to do some form of validation. You want to make sure that, for example, for a storage account, the correct naming conventions applied. You can't just create any name for a storage account. It has to be compliant, obviously, with the Azure naming conventions. So it does quite a bit of that. It loads, obviously, environment variables based on the parameters that you've passed. And then it's just a matter of creating the resource group. We have all these acronyms before, so you can easily see all the abbreviations that you can see what it is. The VNets, the subnets, the key vaults, setting it up, creating the service, app services, storage account, SA, storage account, SQL, as you can see, SQL Server, SQL database, and obviously all the times that it takes, the API, etc., etc. It's almost done. It's doing the, what is this? It needs, obviously, because some of these things are created from scratch, you need to pass the outputs from one of the tasks to the next one to be able to set up, to have that integrated feel. So a lot of these templates, it's not just YAML. A fair bit is scripting, mostly in PowerShell, but they are also, when it comes to ACLs, access control lists, that's done through Python. Let's have a look. Come on. Well, that's the post check, so that's almost done. Yeah, that's done. So the first thing is done. So let's have a look at the resources. So the last step, it creates the resource, the container registry, I meant, sorry. But what we want to see here is, for example, have a look at the virtual net stuff. So when you have a look at the virtual net, it has its subnets. There's 2 of them, and it has service endpoints, obviously. So these are making sure that those services are connected. So setting up, making sure that the app service has access to those endpoints to facilitate that integration between those resources. So that's one aspect. But then when you look at the APIs, app service, we want to have a look at that networking. So as you could see that so that has a dedicated subnet. So let me just see where that's. So that's obviously you want to make sure that that is all connected. So the subnet is associated with that app service. Was it in here? Networking, I thought it was here. Yeah. Let's have a look how far it is. Oops, pipeline's up. Yep, there we go. So that's all completed now. So the container registry, really making sure that it's part of that same subnet, or assigning it to that same subnet, creating the container registry, validating those parameters, and configuring the firewall. So that takes, as you can see, about 15 minutes. We can have a look at the summary. Yeah, and as before, it's dedicated to that. Let's see if that's, so before it was 2 runs. It's the 3rd one, so it's the same version. Stages complete. making sure it's the dedicated environment. And yep, and then the summary. Yep, that's the stuff that you saw. Great. How are we going on time, Tim? I think that's about it. Let me see if there's any slide that I forgot. I don't think so. Yep, that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll have a few questions soon.
Yep. Cool.
Right, you've got a good swath of questions. You did really well. Right at the top of them. First one's from Tim. He likes to line them up early. He wants to know how many different AAD roles are there, and just one, or have you found you need many?
Yeah,
Yes.
so yeah, how complex is all that side of things? Just try to turn your video off and on too, Andreas, see if you'll give it a kick.
Sorry, what was that, Tim?
Your video, try to turn that off and on, because this is frozen at the moment.
Yeah, I've noticed that. Okay, I'll just stop sharing.
It's my best chance of helping you out.
Zoom meeting is not responding. Great. Okay, I might just
yeah, probably don't touch anything.
No, don't touch it. Yeah. I hope the freeze isn't too bad, and I'm pulling a face. Yes. So obviously, when talking about those roles, so it was really just a focus on the when it comes to the Azure deployment infrastructure as code roles. It's your typical roles inside the Azure portal. So those are typically your contributor, reader.
Yeah, okay.
They're out of the box. So from a DevOps perspective, that's it. So obviously from an application perspective, we have many more, because that's really solution specific where we might do that.
Okay.
From a
so you don't have
DevOps
roles that span multiple groups or anything like that?
we do some
administrator roles, yeah.
Yeah. So for the contributor role, it's advised not to do a single member assignment or single developer assignment to a role. You either add it to a known group. So whether that's the infrastructure as code dev group. So there's obviously quite a few nested groups. But yeah, there's a team dedicated to that, the security group that define that convention of what is nested or what group needs to be assigned to what. So that goes through a service desk request too. At a more DevOps work item perspective, for managing pipelines or having access to service connections in DevOps, that's up to the project admins to create separate teams that have separate DevOps roles.
Okay.
Right, Henry Kemp is the next one. He's got, how do development teams consume this approach to infrastructure as code? For example, do they leverage centralized ARM templates to define what they want that is then approved for deployment by the DevOps cloud team?
Yeah, so the deployment is the responsibility of the project team. So they have the capability, or through the collaboration with the infrastructure as code team, to have access to those templates. So yes, they are global templates that should be used. So obviously the infrastructure as code team member will make sure that the correct version is used, or the latest version is used, and apply any changes. But ultimately the project team owns it. It'll be in their project pipeline area where they can deploy it. Obviously, the production pipelines will have additional approval gates that need product owner approvals, but ultimately, it's a project's responsibility, and they pretty much own it. And as I had mentioned, you can change things, but again, that needs to be submitted as a pull request to the global code repository.
That actually leads quite nicely into Henry's next question, which is, how do you handle ARM template updates from Microsoft and refreshing the environment in line with these updated templates?
Yes, good question. So obviously once a project has some level of maturity, there'll be less demand for redeploying environments. So if you have that cadence of where you've got your infrastructure sorted, there might just be, you might not change much, so there's less of that. But obviously if you're in the early stages and really just proof of concepts where you're trying different settings of that environment in terms of, do I scale across 5 app services to have multiple storage accounts? Then yes, of course, you need to have a dependency on the latest and greatest versions that have been updated. So the infrastructure as code is obviously, the team is responsible for that, to make sure that they regression test any latest updates from Microsoft. So that's why they have those test suites. If we have a look at their pipelines, you'll notice a few build failures, which is, some people think great is bad, but that's also a good thing. You have that transparency where something doesn't work anymore. So they stay on top of that. But for the most part, things don't change. But if they do change, the infrastructure as code team will help projects do that. It's in their best interest to do that because, again, you want to avoid being the bottleneck for something that's blocked. So yes, they will help you. They will update the templates, and for the most part, depends on the change. There's obviously major changes, minor changes, and patch changes that you might want to consider in those releases. If it's a patch, you might just want to change a resource. So, for example, if a storage account is changed, you might just want to change that and not the entire environment. But for the most part, their strategy that's adopted is incremental changes. So if the pipeline runs and there is already a storage account with the same configuration, or at least recognized in the incremental strategy, that's left alone, and only the deltas are applied.
Sounds good. I forgot to mention earlier, your Frozen video, at least in my feed, is a very noble stance. So I should reassure you with that.
Because I noticed my chat window is frozen too, so sorry, I can't read it.
All right, Dimitri has the next question. Do you have specific infrastructure templates for each project, or reusing one for multiple projects?
Yes, so yeah. Yes, so it all depends a bit where the roadmap of those. Not all projects start the same time. Not all projects will refer to the same release in terms of that infrastructure as code template. So the releases, you'll notice, will change, and there might be additional mandatory parameters. So for the most part, things look very similar. So I work across several projects. So my role is solution architecture. So I make sure that in a program of work that those projects are looked after from an architecture perspective, but also from a deployment security perspective, because that's part of the design and review and approval process. So yes, we've had projects that were gone to production at a very similar time, and we've been able to reuse those project templates in the next project. So it was pretty much just a copy paste, changing the parameters, and off you were. So within 15 minutes, best scenario, you had a new environment up and running. So yes, there was an element of reuse, but obviously those templates, those global templates, they keep on changing, and so the project template, the master template that you'll use will ultimately change too.
Sounds good. The next one is from Tim, bit of a cheeky one. He wants to know, how big is Anglo's Azure bill?
That's a good question. I don't have access because I'm not in that role. I don't see that. I can see for some resource groups. So the most expensive one that we have is a Kubernetes environment. So I'm working on a project where we have a vendor or a third party that doesn't have a PaaS approach, that needs Docker images to run. So a more neutral approach. And there's It's running on a Windows machine, a Windows OS. It's running about 10 of those up and running all the time. So that's quite expensive. I think that's about, just that project alone is about per VM £1,000 a day. Very expensive. So yeah, I can't give you an amount, but it's
A lot.
We'll just say
lot.
big.
It's big, and it doesn't seem to be an issue. It's when we come to the design approach, obviously that is an element of estimated cost. When we do the review of the design, I've gone through a few of those approval sessions, and that's the bottom of the list. So they're not sure. There's a big drive to get everything in the cloud, and obviously subsequent releases are then a matter of fine-tuning that cost.
Well, we are currently scouting for FinOps talks, so if anybody out there has an opinion, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Right, next question is from Jay. I might have missed the details. How much time was needed for the project, and how was the timeline of each phase? Jay, feel free to unmute yourself and specify, but I believe this was when he was initiating the pipeline.
Maybe. So
yeah, so for the DevOps, we got several phases. Depends on what religions we are using, AWS or whatever.
yeah.
So do you mind telling us for what is your, as a project planner side, how do they actually do the timeline? Is it a month or 2 months, and how they distribute the time for each phases actually? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. It's yeah, it's as I mentioned, it's the culture is a startup culture, a very proof of concept culture. So not much is planned ahead. So it's really running with a couple of loosely defined sprints and loosely estimated T-shirt size estimates, and these get revised. So for most of the projects that I've worked in, we don't have a roadmap beyond a couple of months. It's pretty aggressive when we come to deployments and promoting it to the non-dev environments. But when we look at some of the initial deployments of one of the projects we started last year, kind of proof of concept was deployed in a dev environment for a limited amount of stakeholders, and we built the application, an end-to-end application, a single-page application, which spawned multiple ACI containers to process data science algorithms. So a very visual project. We built it in just a month or two. So those phases were very rapid. Obviously, that's not something that you want to go into production, but it confirmed the business value. The stakeholders were happy. And since December last year, we've been working on making that product more robust, leveraging all the infrastructure as code. And obviously, initially for that project, we built the templates ourselves. Infrastructure as code didn't have any of those templates ready. So obviously since then it's been an evolution. And to answer your question in terms of phases, there are no project managers on these projects. That gives you an idea of the dev-centric approach. So it's really a highly accelerated approach, and really we have the CGD Cloud Governance team and the Design Approval Authority making sure that the security is tight and it's penetration tested. But beyond that, there's not much more governance. There's very little red tape. Obviously, when it comes to more the projects that are bigger, that go beyond proof of concepts, that have many stakeholders and many users, obviously there's a bit more rigor, and those phases are stretched out. But yeah, since January, we've worked on a lot of more features. So across dev to prod, that's taken about six, 7 months. If I understood the phases correctly.
Many thanks. Many thanks.
Cool.
So Henry has thrown in yet another question. He's very good at this. He wants to know if you have any thoughts on Terraform and using it to simplify the configuration needed to define or deploy Azure resources.
Yes. Yeah, so that was evaluated at the beginning. We had to decide, do we take Terraform or YAML or the ARM templates? I don't have much experience, and it was up to the infrastructure as code vendor that was part of their proposal. So that was accepted by Anglo as the standard and the convention. So to answer your question, yes, there are quite significant changes or differences between the two, but just based on the skills that we had on deck and the expertise of the consultants that Anglo had, for the most part, the YAML, that ARM template approach was opted for. Yeah, that's as much as I can say in terms of from an Anglo perspective.
Sounds good. Right, the last question we've got in the chat is from Fred. He wants to know, how do you cater for HA and DR?
Yes. So the high availability is through that front door and through the gateways, and obviously with all that comes load balancing. It's part of that front door capability. It includes load balancing, it includes firewalls, etc., etc. It all depends on whether it's an internal or an external exposable app. So API Manager comes with a lot of load balancing. There's a lot of configuration. It depends what high availability you're catering for, whether it's just web requests or whether it's consuming messages off a queue to spawn Kubernetes processes. So obviously, it depends on the environment that you work on. But again, that is part of those, I showed it to you earlier, those archetypes. When it comes to those configuration, that's all bundled. Obviously, the project will need to define that criteria of what is a configuration for high availability, or not just high availability, but also scaling, horizontal scaling. Obviously, those need to be defined by the project, because obviously high availability does come with a cost, coming back to the cost, and obviously coming back to who's using it, the amount of users. So there's obviously different options, but again, the infrastructure has kind of thought of it, and they have templates for it. When it comes to disaster recovery, again, when it comes to the scaling, the horizontal scaling, you obviously want your geo-redundant storage, so all your storage accounts will come configured with replication. It again depends on what type of recovery you're looking at, whether that's storage or others. Again, that comes part of that configuration where you define that. I haven't worked with it much because we haven't had that requirement as much. Most of the project that we've been working on, as I mentioned, was proof of concepts, where that wasn't much of an issue, because firstly, all the code has been version controlled, all the infrastructure is version controlled, so that aspect is safe. Obviously, when it comes to the data or the working data of those projects, you might lose that, but again, it's proof of concept, and a lot of that data, the initial seed data, is also version controlled.
Sounds good.
You could have never moved at this pace, Andreas, if it was anything other than a proof of concept type arrangement. Is that really? Yep.
It was the initial work that we did, unrelated to DevOps, was helping Anglo accelerate these projects. So we worked on common libraries or core libraries for both the front end, the UI applications, but also the back end, but also not just functionality, but the branding and the look and feel of web applications. For example, you don't want every project to think about, you know, where are we going to put this menu item or where are we going to put this action. So you want to be able to accelerate it. And so part of the DevOps was really just not just the build and the deployment, but also having artifacts available, shareable artifacts in the form of NPM packages or NuGet packages that projects can consume or reference. That gives you an out-of-the-box sample application where you can do your .NET restore or whatever, a yarn install, and you have a front end running with an API that you can run locally. So that just all, it's part of their culture, you know, to automate and really just to fast track proof of concepts, get the value out as quickly to mostly geologists and mining managers to get features out there and see if it provides a bit of business value that's needed.
So it sounds like they're in a fairly mature place. So I'd really like to know, are you going to throw a little bit of chaos engineering at them?
I think it's already part of that maturity. I think chaos is part of their maturity. It's I think they at least from my perspective, is it is a disruptive environment. So when you see another version of something go out, you go, oh, really? Do I need to adopt that version? So I think it's part of their culture. It's like, let's try it. Let's have a spike. It doesn't matter if it fails. Let's give it a go. So I guess that's also part of their culture. Of maybe a good thing or bad thing is very, very few business analysts and project managers on board. A lot of it is run through the subject matter experts, most of them being geologists, and just working with the architects and developers to get something working.
Well, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us today. It's been fantastic hearing the journey of an enterprise that has a fair amount of maturity from the sound of it for the DevOps practices, which is great to hear. So thank you again. We should wrap it up here because we're almost at 7:30. Just another quick reminder, we've got that next talk coming up on the 21st of October if you're interested in a little bit of AWS this time. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in 3 weeks.
Yeah,
thanks very much, mate.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay.
See you, mate.
Thank you.
Have a good one,
everyone.
Yeah. Bye.
See you next time. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
See you,
Bye.
Tim. Thanks. Bye.
Betcha.
Bye.
Bye, Fred. Yeah. Did you want to hang around for a bit, Andreas?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah, if there's any other questions, yep, no worries.